Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. Darkness settled over the Galactic Council chamber, deep and absolute, save for the cold illumination of the central holographic display. The vast hall, carved from a single slab of obsidian black stone, swallowed sound, absorbing the weight of a decision that had taken centuries to reach. 1,000 alien eyes, some narrow and slit-pupiled, others faceted like the eyes of an insect, still more hidden behind shifting membranes of translucent flesh, fixed upon the image flickering before them. A world suspended in the void, blue and green, its oceans vast and unbroken, its continents etched by the patient hand of time. Earth, the condemned. High Chancellor Vorton rose from his place at the head of the chamber, his towering form casting a spindly shadow against the polished floor. His elongated skull gleamed under the dim lights, the sharp ridges of his cheekbones accentuated by the hollowness of his expression. His species had long abandoned the need for overt emotion. Centuries of political dominance had taught them the art of stillness, the power in silence. Yet when he spoke, his voice was a blade, precise and without hesitation. "It is decided." The words hung in the air, final and immutable. The gathered representatives of the council, elders and warlords, scholars and sovereigns of 100 species, offered no argument. There was none to be had. The deliberations had been long, the debates exhausting, but the conclusion had always been inevitable. Humanity was a danger that could not be tolerated. For centuries, the Galactic Council had upheld a singular truth. Unchecked aggression led to ruin. Every species that had ever reached the stars had, at one point, stood at the precipice of self-destruction. The Council existed to ensure that no civilization ever toppled into the abyss. The price of peace had always been sacrifice, an offering, a tempering. Some species were forced to sterilize an entire generation to curb their rapid expansion. Others have been made to surrender entire fleets, their warships dismantled before they could become weapons of conquest. A species that resisted these measures, that failed to restrain its own destructive instincts, was left with only one option: eradication. Humanity had resisted. Their wars were endless, their ambitions insatiable. From a moment they had left their homeworld, they had fought against each other, against the silence of space, against anything that stood between them and expansion. Their history was a record of conquest, of empires rising and collapsing in blood. And yet, for all their violence, they were relentless survivors. No single cataclysm had ever been enough to break them. They adapted, they rebuilt, they spread. That, more than anything, was the threat they posed. Most species had a center, a single homeworld or system upon which their entire existence hinged. A planet to be raised, a capital to be seized, a government to be dismantled. But humanity had never accepted such constraints. They had scattered like embers caught in a solar wind, leaving behind only whispers of their presence. Hidden colonies, deep space outposts, ghost ships drifting in the black. Still, the Council held power. Power absolute, power unquestioned. And power, when wielded with precision, could extinguish even the most stubborn flame. The extermination fleet moves at dawn. Vorton continued, his voice devoid of triumph, only certainty. Humanity will be no more. Let this be our final war. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Some in agreement, others in weary resignation. A few, very few, remained silent in quiet dissent. There were those who had argued that such destruction was unnecessary, that humanity could be brought to heel, controlled. That extermination was not only excessive but impractical. They were the minority, and in matters of survival, the minority did not dictate the will of the Council. Vorton's gaze swept over them, his black, oil-slick eyes unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and departed, his cloak of woven starlight trailing behind him. One by one, the others followed, until the chamber was empty, the holographic image of Earth still spinning in the silence. Far from the sterile halls of the council, in the uncharted void where laws held no sway, another meeting was taking place. The room was small, metallic walls stained with years of oil and smoke. A single light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows over the faces gathered around the war table. There were no grand speeches here, no ceremony, only cold, precise calculations of survival. General Elias Rourke studied the data scrolling before him, his sharp eyes flicking over fleet movements, projected battle strategies, intercepted transmissions. The Council's decision had not come as a surprise. They had been moving toward it for years. The moment the vote had been cast, the war had already begun. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, fingers drumming against the table's edge. His uniform was worn at the seams, stripped of unnecessary insignia, the mark of a man who had long abandoned the idea of titles. Rourke had been fighting this war long before the Council had declared it. He had been born into it, raised in the shadow of dying colonies and burning skies. While the politicians of Earth had pleaded for negotiations, for coexistence, he and those like him had known the truth. Humanity would never be allowed to coexist. They think we're prey. His voice, low and steady, carried through the room. That's their first mistake. The officers seated around him, captains, tacticians, men and women who had traded their futures for the promise of resistance, watched him in silence. Some with grim anticipation, others with calculating detachment. None with fear. Fear was a luxury they had abandoned long ago. They assume we'll scatter, Rourke continued, his gaze sweeping over them. That we'll run, fight like cornered animals. That we'll make our last stand and die with some misguided sense of honor. He let the words settle, then shook his head. But they don't understand us. Not really. He tapped a control, and the holographic display shifted. Not the shattered remains of Earth's old fleets, not the fractured remnants of a dying species, but something else. Something hidden. The real fleet. Scattered across a dozen uncharted systems, buried beneath ice worlds and drifting in the depths of black holes. Ships with no transponders, stations without official records. A force built not for open war, but for something far deadlier. They believe this will be swift, Rourke said, his voice almost amused. That they'll exterminate us like they would a disease. They don't realize the truth. His fingers tightened into a fist against the table. We are the disease. We don't die. We adapt. We infect. We survive. A chuckle from the shadows, dry, humorless. Bold statement, General. He didn't turn. A true one. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a near whisper. The Council has committed to our destruction. That means they've already lost. Another tap of his fingers, and the display changed again. Supply lines. Infrastructure. Key weaknesses in the Council's vast empire. Vulnerabilities carved into its foundation over centuries of complacency. We won't fight them head on, he said. We'll bleed them, turn their allies against them, corrupt their systems, sabotage their networks, make them fear the dark. Silence stretched, heavy and absolute. Then, slowly, one by one, his officers nodded. The Council believed it had declared a war. It had not. It had declared an extinction, and it had chosen the wrong species. The Oblivion's wake drifted like a shadow in the abyss, its hull swallowing what little light reached this forsaken stretch of space. Here, beyond the mapped territories, where the Council's control was a distant concept, a different kind of war brewed. A war not fought with brute force, but with patience, precision, and the ruthless cunning of a species that had spent centuries perfecting the art of survival. General Elias Rourke stood in the ship's war room, his presence commanding without effort. The glow from the central holographic display cast sharp blue light across his weathered features, deepening the lines carved by experience rather than age. Around him, officers of varying ranks occupied their places, a collection of humanity's last strategists, tacticians, and warfighters. Some had been officers in Earth's old military. Others had risen from the chaos after its fall. All of them bore the marks of war, whether in scars of flesh or the hollow weight behind their eyes. Captain Adrian Vale leaned against the table's edge, arms crossed, watching Rourke with a mixture of familiarity and expectation. She had seen him in moments like this before. The stillness before the strike, the quiet calculation in his gaze as he pieced together the shape of the battle before it began. He broke the silence with a single word. Tritium. The holographic display shifted, revealing the asteroid belt known as Asphodel Drift, a scattered field of rock and ice on the outskirts of a dying star system. Among its debris was a single structure, a mining facility, once operated by private interests, now firmly under the Council's control. A vital hub for tritium refinement, one of the many sources that fed their war machine. Without it, fleet deployments would slow, resource chains would stretch thin, and, more importantly, the illusion of the Council's untouchability would crack. Vale exhaled sharply. A refinery strike. That'll get their attention. Rourke's gaze didn't shift. It's not about attention. It's about message. We don't just take it. We make sure the whole damn galaxy sees it burn. A low murmur passed through the officers. Commander Halstead, his cybernetic arm glinting in the dim light, frowned. That's a bold opening move, General. Direct assault on a Council facility? If it doesn't go as planned, it will. Rourke cut through his doubt with quiet certainty. Halstead didn't look convinced. I assume you've accounted for their response. Rourke turned to the display again, and the image changed. A series of fleet routes overlaid the map, marking the known positions of Council patrols. Most were concentrated near the inner systems, where their primary fleets prepared for Earth's final destruction. Only a handful of ships remained stationed near the Asphodel Drift, not enough to repel a sudden, coordinated strike. They've left it exposed, Rourke continued. The bulk of their forces are focused elsewhere. They assume their automated defenses are deterrent enough. They're wrong. Vale studied the projections, nodding slightly. You want a small strike force. Small, fast, and precise, Rourke confirmed. We don't engage their patrols unless necessary. In and out before they can call for reinforcements. We overload their processing centers, detonate their fuel reserves, and let the resulting explosion light up half the system. He shifted his attention back to the gathered officers. The message isn't just for the Council. It's for every species forced under their rule. We're showing them that the Council isn't invincible. Halstead sighed through his nose, running his fingers over the metal of his cybernetic arm. And if they respond faster than expected, they will respond, Rourke acknowledged. But they won't know where we'll hit next. They'll be forced to spread their forces thin, divert ships from other operations. Every system they reinforce is one left vulnerable somewhere else. Silence settled as the officers processed the strategy. It was not just about striking a target. It was about forcing the Council into a state of reaction, dictating the pace of the war before it had even truly begun. Vale tapped the table, considering. We'll need more than explosives. If we can override their communication array, send out a broadcast before the place goes up, we'll amplify the effect. Let them hear our voices before they see the fire. Rourke gave a small nod of approval. Then we planned for that. A new display flickered to life. Schematics of the refinery structure, its weaknesses, the security systems that would need bypassing. Asphodel Drift had been designed to operate with minimal human oversight, relying instead on automated sentries and AI-controlled security measures. That made it predictable. Predictability was an advantage. Halstead rubbed his jaw. We'll need infiltration teams to disable those defenses before the main strike force moves in. I'll take point on that, Vale said without hesitation. Small crew, nothing flashy. Get in, kill their eyes and ears, and make sure the Council's first warning is the explosion itself. Rourke didn't hesitate. Do it. A pause stretched in the room, tension thick in the air. This was the moment when plans transformed into action, when theory became blood and fire. Halstead exhaled sharply. Then I suppose it begins. No, Rourke corrected, glancing around the room at the faces of those who would shape the war to come. It began the moment they thought we'd already lost. Vale smirked, pushing away from the table. Then let's remind them how wrong they were. There were no cheers, no rallying cries, Only the quiet exchange of nods, the unspoken understanding that every person in the room had already accepted what came next. They had no home to retreat to, no fallback position. This war would end one way or another, with extinction or survival. As the meeting concluded, Rourke lingered behind, gaze fixed on the map of the refinery. Vale remained as well, arms still crossed, expression unreadable. She finally spoke, voice quieter than before. "You think this'll work? If I didn't, I wouldn't be standing here." She studied him for a long moment. "That's not what I asked." Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't answer right away, and she seemed to take that as answer enough. She pushed off the table. "Just don't make a martyr out of yourself." He let out a dry breath of amusement. "I'm not in the business of martyrdom." "No," she said over her shoulder as she walked toward the exit. "You're in the business of making other people into them." She left without another word. Rourke turned back to the display, the cold glow reflecting in his eyes. Asphodel Drift was waiting. And soon, so would the rest of the galaxy. The Oblivion's wake drifted through the black, its engines running silent, its hull camouflaged against the vast emptiness of space. Asphodel Drift loomed ahead, its jagged asteroid belt forming a natural barrier around the refinery. What had once been a mining station, an unremarkable node in the Council's vast network, was now the stage for a battle that neither side had fully anticipated. Inside the warship, General Elias Rourke stood over the tactical display, studying the shifting patterns of enemy defenses. The plan had been clean, efficient. Strike hard, disable communications, cripple the refinery, and retreat before reinforcements arrived. Now, with a Council destroyer sitting between them and an easy exit, nothing about it was clean anymore. Captain Adrian Vale paced beside him, arms folded. "This wasn't supposed to happen. They were ready for us," Rourke said, his voice unreadable. "But not completely. They reacted too slowly at first. If this was a full trap, they should have been waiting with more than one destroyer." Vale frowned. "So either someone leaked our movements, or we got unlucky. Or both." Commander Halstead, standing across from them, exhaled sharply. "We should consider an abort, sir." Rourke looked up, fixing him with a steady gaze. Halstead wasn't wrong. The smart move was to cut their losses. But retreat now, and they lost more than a battle. They lost the war's first real statement. "We're not leaving empty-handed," Rourke said. "The refinery still burns. That message is too important." Halstead's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he shifted tactics. "Then at least let's acknowledge the problem. The destroyer outguns us, and they know we're here. If we engage directly, we're dead." Vale's fingers tapped against the table's edge. "They haven't moved to intercept yet. They're holding position, which means they're waiting for something," Rourke muttered. His mind worked through the possibilities. Were more reinforcements inbound? Or was the destroyer's crew hesitating, unsure if they should strike? The Council's military wasn't known for indecision, but something had thrown them off balance. Vale's comm earpiece crackled. "Captain, we've got something," said Lieutenant Korn from the bridge. "Intercepted a Council transmission. It's weird." "Weird how?" There was a pause, then Korn patched the audio through. The voice was sharp, strained. A Council officer, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. "Impossible. We were assured the intelligence was correct. The humans should not have reached the station this quickly." A second voice, lower, controlled. "Orders remain. Hold until confirmation." The transmission cut. Vale looked at Rourke. "That doesn't sound like a crew in control." "It sounds like a crew waiting for permission to fire," Rourke said, piecing it together. Halstead's brow furrowed. "Permission from who?" That was the question. The Council didn't normally micromanage battlefield decisions. If this destroyer had orders to wait, that meant someone higher up was calling the shots and hesitating. Vale shook her head. "So we might have a leak in an opening." "Maybe," Rourke admitted. "Either way, we don't waste it." He turned back to the tactical display. The refinery's structural integrity was already failing from the planted charges. The detonation sequence had been set. But now, with the destroyer in play, they needed a more calculated approach. "We use the wreckage," he said. "When the refinery blows, it'll throw out enough debris to mess with their targeting systems. We time it right. We punch through before they get a clear shot. Halstead nodded slowly. That still leaves the destroyer operational. If they recover before we're gone, they'll follow. Rourke's fingers drummed against the table. He could order another torpedo strike, but that relied too much on luck. The alternative was closer, riskier. Vale, you still have charges left. She raised an eyebrow. You're thinking boarding action. They're hesitant now. A direct hit to their weapons array will make them hesitate longer. Halstead let out a breath. You're talking about putting people on a council destroyer. I am, Rourke confirmed. Vale grinned, despite the stakes. Well, it's not the dumbest thing you've asked me to do. Minutes later, the boarding team was prepped. A modified dropship, reinforced for breaching, hovered in Oblivion's Wake's launch bay. Vale strapped in beside her squad, checking her weapon as the countdown to launch began. The refinery below groaned as its metal frame began to buckle. Flames spread through its corridors, oxygen venting into space in gouts of fire. The council destroyer held its position, still waiting for the order to engage. 5 seconds, Corin's voice came over the comms. 4, 3, the refinery exploded. The shockwave expanded outward, sending chunks of debris careening in every direction. A wall of fire and metal rushed toward the destroyer, blinding its sensors for a crucial few seconds. Go, Rourke ordered. Vale's dropship launched, skimming dangerously close to the debris field. Chunks of burning wreckage bounced off its hull, but the pilot held steady, threading a path toward the destroyer's exposed flank. Inside the enemy vessel, alarms blared as crew scrambled to restore visuals. A tactical officer called out, "Explosion has disrupted targeting. We're blind on sensors." The captain, a tall, gray-skinned officer with dark, needle-like eyes, gritted his teeth. Find them. Now. They never saw Vale's team coming. The drop ship latched onto the destroyer's side, magnetic clamps locking it in place. Cutting torches flared, slicing through hull plating. Then the door blew inward, and Vale's squad stormed through the breach. Gunfire erupted. Council soldiers fell caught off guard. Vale moved fast, leading her squad toward the weapons array. If they could disable the primary cannons, Oblivion's Wake had a clear escape. A security team rounded the corner. Vale threw herself into cover as plasma bolts seared past. She leaned out, took 3 precise shots. 2 bodies dropped. The third retreated. Rourke's voice came over comms. Vale, status. Busy, she responded, kicking open a hatch and planting an explosive on the control panel. 30 seconds to fireworks. On the bridge, the council captain was shouting orders. Weapons control, report. A trembling officer checked his display. Sir, we've lost primary targeting. Manual override is down. Then the charge detonated. The destroyer's cannons went dark. Vale sprinted back toward the breach. We're done here. Her squad piled into the drop ship. As it detached, flames burst through the enemy vessel's hull. The ship buckled, unable to fire, unable to follow. On Oblivion's Wake's bridge, Rourke watched the tactical display. The moment the drop ship cleared the blast radius, he gave the final order. Jump! The ship's engines flared, and the void swallowed them whole. Silence filled the cabin as the crew processed what had just happened. They had taken the risk, and they had won. Vale pulled off her helmet, exhaling. That was messy. Rourke nodded. It was. Halstead shook his head. They'll come back harder. They will, Rourke agreed. Then he glanced at the display, where the last recorded transmission from the council destroyer flickered. Hold until confirmation. Someone on the other side had hesitated. Someone with authority. Vale frowned. What are you thinking? Rourke stared at the data, his mind already moving to the next step. That we're not just fighting ships. A pause. We're fighting ghosts in their own chain of command. The Oblivion's Wake cut through the abyss, its engines humming with restrained power. Beyond its reinforced hull, the void stretched unbroken, a vast and silent witness to the war now unfolding. In the distance, the wreckage of Asphodel drift smoldered, glowing embers adrift in weightless suspension. The refinery was gone. The council destroyer was crippled, but the battle had not ended. It had only shifted into something far more dangerous, something unseen. General Elias Rourke stood in the dim glow of the war room's holographic display, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the intercepted transmission playing on repeat. A simple phrase, hold until confirmation, for words that meant nothing on their own, but in the right context, they unraveled an entire narrative. Someone within the Council's chain of command had hesitated. Someone powerful enough to override standard engagement protocols. That hesitation had bought them time, had kept the destroyer from opening fire the moment it arrived. And time, in war, was leverage. Captain Adrian Vale leaned against the table, watching him. Someone inside the Council didn't want that ship engaging. That's interesting. It's more than interesting, Rourke said. It's useful. Commander Halstead frowned. Or it's a trap. Vale smirked. You're not wrong. But if there's a crack in their armor, we'd be idiots not to exploit it. Halstead exhaled sharply, but said nothing. He had long since learned that arguing against risks was pointless in a war where survival itself was a gamble. Rourke tapped the display, shifting the projection to a galactic map. We've hit them once. We need to keep them on the back foot. If they're hesitating, it means there's more going on beneath the surface. His gaze flicked to Vale. What do we know about council politics? She shrugged. Nothing's certain. They like to project unity, but any empire this size has fractures. We've just never had the means to dig into them. Rourke considered. Maybe it's time we did. A sharp chime interrupted the conversation. Lieutenant Corrin's voice crackled through the comms. General, we have something on long-range scanners. It's unusual. Rourke and the others exchanged glances before heading for the bridge. The main display showed an incoming signal, faint but persistent. Not a distress call, not a tracking beacon, something else. Corrin adjusted the frequency. It's encoded, but not council encryption. It's human. Rourke's brow furrowed. Who the hell else is out here? Corrin worked the controls. Signal's weak. It's bouncing off debris fields. Whoever sent it didn't want it traced easily. He hesitated. There's a message embedded. Play it. The speakers crackled. Static filled the cabin. Then a voice emerged, distorted but unmistakably human. If you're hearing this, you're not alone. There are others. We are watching. We are waiting. Contact soon. The message ended. Silence stretched across the bridge. Vale folded her arms. Well, that's new. Halstead's frown deepened. Could be a council ploy. Lure us in. Force us into a trap. Rourke shook his head. No. If they wanted us, they'd have sent warships, not riddles. Corrin checked his instruments. Signals coming from a drifting freighter for sectors out. No active propulsion, minimal life support. Whoever sent this isn't sitting in a battleship. Vale glanced at Rourke. So what's the play? He studied the flickering signal. If this was real, it changed everything. A resistance beyond their own forces? A faction with intelligence on the council's fractures? But if it was a lie, if it was bait, they were walking blind into an ambush. Rourke exhaled. We go in, but we go in smart. The Oblivion's wake altered course. Hours later, they approached the freighter. It floated in the dark, battered and half dead, its hull pockmarked with old battle scars. No running lights. No transmission pings beyond the original message. Vale muttered, "This looks inviting." Rourke ignored the comment. Corrin scanned for life signs. Faint. Could be interference or just low power. Rourke made his decision. Vale, take a team. Keep comms open. If this goes sideways, we pull you out. She grinned. I love it when a plan depends on me not dying. Minutes later, she and her squad crossed the void, mag boots clamping against the freighter surface. They breached a rusted airlock and stepped inside. The ship was a graveyard. Emergency lighting flickered, casting long, broken shadows. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of metal and decay. No signs of a struggle, just silence. Vale activated her helmet scanner. I don't like this. The corridor ahead led to the bridge. The door was half open, jammed. She forced it the rest of the way and stepped inside. A single figure sat in the captain's chair. A woman, gaunt but alive, her face lit by the dim glow of an old console. She didn't react as Vale approached. Vale lifted her weapon. Who are you? The woman exhaled, slow and deliberate. Then she looked up. Someone who should be dead. Vale's finger twitched on the trigger. Try that again. The woman leaned back. I sent the message. You answered. That makes you desperate or reckless. Maybe both. Vale smirked. And what does that make you? The woman's expression didn't change. The reason you're not already dead. Vale hesitated, and she pressed her earpiece. Rourke, you're going to want to hear this. Minutes later, Rourke himself stepped onto the freighter's bridge, studying the woman carefully. There was something unsettling in her presence. Not fear, not desperation. A knowing. He crossed his arms. Start talking. The woman met his gaze without flinching. The council's breaking. Vale glanced at Rourke, then back at the woman. You'll have to be more specific. The woman stood. There are those within their ranks who believe in extermination. And there are those who don't. Rourke's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. And you're one of them? She tilted her head. Once. Halstead stepped forward, voice sharp. Why would we trust you? The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because the alternative is assuming the council will never falter. And we both know that's a lie. Rourke studied her. What's your name? She hesitated, just briefly. Then, Celine Varos. Vale blinked. You're joking. Rourke's face remained unreadable. Celine Varos. The name was etched into history. The former council officer who had supposedly defected and died years ago. But she was standing here. Celine sighed. I don't have time to convince you. But if you're serious about this war, you need me. Rourke held her gaze. Then, slowly he nodded. Then start proving it. The war had just changed. Again, the Oblivion's wake hung in the darkness, a silent predator in the cold expanse. The remnants of Asphodel Drift were long behind them, but the weight of the battle still clung to the air. Tension hummed beneath the surface, a current running through the crew, their unease made worse by the presence of Celine Varos. She sat across from General Elias Rourke in the dimly lit war room, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. She did not fidget. She did not plead. She did not look like a woman who had spent years in exile, hunted by the very council she once served. If anything, she looked like someone who had never stopped playing the game. Rourke studied her in silence, reading between the lines of what she hadn't yet said. Vale stood near the entrance, arms crossed, her expression a careful mask of skepticism. Halstead sat stiffly to the side, his fingers curled into a fist against the table. So, Rourke said at last, his voice even, you're alive? That's already one lie the council told. Celine's lips curved slightly. They tell many. Vale scoffed. And you were one of them. Celine turned her head just enough to acknowledge Vale, her expression unreadable. Yes. The admission landed heavy in the room. Rourke leaned forward. Why defect? Celine exhaled slowly. I believe in order. Stability. I thought the council ensured that. Then I saw what happened to the civilizations that didn't conform to their definition of peace. She met his eyes. I saw what was coming for years long before they made their decision. Rourke kept his expression neutral. And yet, you were part of it. Yes, she said again, without hesitation. Until I wasn't. Halstead's voice was edged with distrust. And now you're here, on this ship, trying to convince us you're worth trusting. Celine finally moved, leaning forward slightly. I'm not asking for trust, Commander. I'm offering something you don't have. Rourke waited. She tapped the table. The war isn't what you think. Vale arched an eyebrow. Enlighten us. Celine didn't look away from Rourke. The council isn't united. They never have been, but the decision to exterminate humanity has widened the fractures. Some believe wiping you out is necessary for lasting peace. Others see it for what it is, wasteful, unsustainable. Rourke tilted his head slightly. And where did you fall? Her smile didn't reach her eyes. On the losing side. Halstead wasn't convinced. If the council has factions, why haven't we seen it? Why no signs of internal war? They won't allow it to be seen. Not yet, Celine answered. The dissent is controlled, buried under layers of diplomacy and bureaucracy. But it's there. And if you push hard enough in the right places, those fractures will crack open. Rourke considered her words. If she was lying, she was playing a long game. But if she was telling the truth, They were sitting on an opportunity far greater than they had imagined. Vale's voice cut through the silence. Say we believe you. What exactly are you offering? Celine leaned back. Leverage. You don't just need battles. You need chaos. You need their own people questioning their leadership, doubting the war, hesitating when the moment comes to strike. Rourke exhaled. And you know where push. Celine met his gaze. I do. The room fell into silence again. Halstead spoke first. She's dangerous. So are we, Vale countered. Halstead turned to Rourke. And if she's lying? Rourke didn't look away from Celine. Then we kill her. Celine didn't flinch. Fair. A slow grin tugged at the corner of Vale's mouth. I like her. Rourke stood. You want to prove yourself? Then we move now. Celine nodded once. I'll need access to your intelligence network. Vale scoffed. That's cute. Celine gave her a knowing look. You're already playing blind. You need better eyes. Rourke studied her for another long moment before turning to Corin, who had been listening from the bridge's tactical station. Set a course. We'll test her information. If she's right, we move forward. Corin nodded. And if she's wrong? Rourke looked back at Celine. Then she won't have to worry about it. Celine smiled again, slow and knowing. The war was about to change again. The Oblivion's wake moved through the void with quiet purpose, its engines running cold, its hull blending seamlessly with the darkness. Every member of its crew felt the weight of the moment pressing down on them, heavier than any battle they had fought before. This wasn't just another strike, another attempt to bleed the council dry. This was the endgame. General Elias Rourke stood on the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the tactical display. The galactic map before him was marked with shifting fleet movements, coded transmissions, and points of weakness in the Council's defenses. But maps did not show the true shape of war. War was hesitation in an enemy's voice, the slow erosion of faith, the unraveling of certainty. Celine Varos stood beside him, watching the same display. They're not ready for this. They think they are, Rourke replied. She nodded. That's what makes it worse for them. Vale leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed. So, tell me again why this doesn't end with us getting glassed from orbit? Celine smirked. Because the Council is already losing. They just don't know it yet. Vale exhaled sharply. Not comforting. Rourke didn't look away from the map. She's right. The final strike was not about firepower. It was about timing. Over the last few weeks, they had done more than wage war. They had turned the Council against itself. Sabotage in key supply lines, intelligence leaks that forced commanders to question their orders, diplomatic pressure on species that had once been silent allies. The Council, once an unshakable force, was splintering. And now, they would break it completely. Corin's voice crackled through the comms. We've got movement. Council fleets are repositioning. Looks like they're shifting to defend their core systems. Rourke allowed himself a slow breath. Then it's working. Vale frowned. Doesn't that mean they'll just dig in? No, Celine answered before Rourke could. It means they're afraid. The Council was built on control. The moment they started reacting instead of dictating, they had already lost. Now, they were pulling forces back to their strongholds, leaving outer systems exposed, abandoning weaker allies in favor of protecting their own interests. The cracks had spread too far. The illusion of invincibility was gone. Rourke turned to the crew. We strike the seat of their power. Directly. Halstead straightened. You're suggesting a full assault on their command world? No. Rourke corrected. We don't need to take it. We just need to make sure no one listens to them anymore. Celine's lips curved slightly. We turn their own leaders against each other. The plan was simple in execution, devastating in effect. The Council's ruling body was already divided, some advocating for escalation, others desperate for a way out. But no one wanted to be the first to break. Rourke intended to force their hand. Vale raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do we do that? Celine tapped the map, highlighting a single location, a secure relay station in a dead system. We give them proof that they've already lost. The relay held the Council's most classified transmissions, encrypted orders, hidden records of every strategic failure they had tried to bury. If those files were broadcasted to the galaxy, Their allies would see the truth, that the war was unsustainable, that their leaders had been covering up losses, that their supposed unity was a lie. Rourke nodded. We take the relay, we expose them, and we let the panic do the rest. Halstead let out a breath. Risky. Necessary, Rourke countered. Vale shook her head with a smirk. So, let's go ruin their day. The Oblivion's wake jumped to slip space, vanishing into the black. When they emerged at the relay station, the Council had already deployed defenses, 2 warships, and a small fleet of interceptors. Expected. Rourke stood steady. Corin, keep us moving. Vale, take the boarding team. Vale grinned, already strapping in her gear. Don't wait up. The assault was swift. Oblivion's wake wove through enemy fire, its weapons carving through interceptors as Vale and her team launched toward the relay. They breached the station with controlled precision, cutting through automated defenses and overwhelming security teams. Inside the control center, Vale planted a device on the main terminal, linking it to the Oblivion's wake systems. We're in. Celine worked fast, bypassing encryption, pulling classified files, routing them to hundreds of open channels across the galaxy. Council deception, war crimes, internal conflicts, it all went live. On the bridge, Corin let out a low whistle as the transmission spread. Well, that should do it. Across Council space, their allies hesitated. Fleet stopped mid-flight. Commanders hesitated before issuing orders. The illusion was shattered. Then, the killing blow. Rourke's voice cut through every frequency, reaching every corner of the war. To the people of the galaxy, your leaders have lied. They told you this war was necessary, that we were the threat. But the truth is here for all to see. The Council is not invincible. They are not united, and they are not in control. A pause. They wanted humanity to be their sacrifice. Instead, we are the reckoning they never saw coming. As the message spread, the Council's forces fractured. Some ships turned on each other. Some surrendered outright. Others fled. The collapse had begun. Vale's voice came through the comms. Relays rigged. Ready to go. Rourke nodded. Do it. The charges detonated. The relay station crumbled into fire and debris. The war was over. Not in a single battle, not in one final fight, but in the slow, inevitable collapse of an empire that had ruled through fear and silence. As the Oblivion's wake pulled away, Rourke exhaled. Vale sat beside him, watching the screens. So we won. Rourke's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. We survived. She grinned. I'll take it. Celine watched the stars ahead. They won't all fall at once. Some will fight. Some will deny it. They will, Rourke agreed. But they won't win. For the first time in a long time, the future was unknown. But for the first time in history, humanity had written its own fate.